I don't know if you noticed, but it's the disciples who ask Jesus, Rabbi, who sinned? This man or his parents? The disciples. These are the ones who've been following Jesus, who've been learning from him. And here is this man in need of healing, and the disciples don't see a person, they see a problem. They don't ask about the man. They ask about the category of sin. Who is the sinner? Who's to blame? These disciples are not looking into this man's blind eyes. They are not offering compassion. They aren't even really looking for a person. They're looking for a cause. Not the kind of cause that you advocate for, a cause, a reason. They want an explanation. They want to label it so they can understand it. That instinct to explain suffering and trouble by assigning guilt is as old as humanity. And it also lies at the story of wicked and wicked for good.
Alpha Withrop, I know you're out here. Just come in before the monkeys spot you.
There's no going back. This is between us, the wizard and I.
The Wicked Witch can't elude us forever. Not with Prince Fiero and his squadron hot on her trail.
No good deed goes unpunished. That's my creed.
The wonderful Wizard of Oz. No one believed in you more than I did.
Elphaba. They're coming for you.
I've heard it said that people come into our lives for a reason. I know I'm who I am today because I knew you.
Think of what we could do together.
Like a comet pulled from orbit as it passes the sun. Like a seed dropped by a skybird in a distant war. Who can say if I've been changed for the better?
Bring me the root of the Wicked Witch of the West.
For a while there, I thought you changed.
I have changed.
It's time. For both of us.
To fly! Because I knew you.
You're the only friend I ever had.
Because I knew you.
And I've had so many friends.
I have been changed for good.
But only one that mattered.
I'm off to see the wizard.
So, how many of you have seen both of the movies? How many of you only seen the first one? And how many of you have only seen the second one? All right, so, see both of them. They're worth it. But let me just give it to you in 30 seconds. The gospel, according to Wicked, goes something like this. A young woman is born different. Because she's different, people fear her. Because they fear her, those in power discover that she's useful as an enemy. And the more that Elphaba resists injustice, the more she advocates for the oppressed and defends the marginalized, the more she's labeled wicked, dangerous. Eventually, an entire society believes the lie until almost no one remembers the real person behind the name Wicked Witch. And the story asks a haunting question: who gets called wicked and why? This is exactly the question Jesus asks us to consider in John 9. Everyone around this blind man already has an explanation. They all think they know who he is. They have already decided what his blindness means. It's the result of sin. It's something wicked, either in him or his parents. And then this becomes this wonderful allegory about spiritual blindness as Jesus and the Pharisees debate this miracle healing that the Pharisees want to say they haven't seen. Now, it's tempting whenever we're studying one of Jesus's many messages about spiritual blindness to think of someone else who needs to hear it. I can always see those people around me who are blind. But Jesus asks us something different, and I credit John's writing of this story, John's memory. He notices the scribes probably think the disciples need to hear this message about spiritual blindness. The disciples probably think the Pharisees need to hear it. The Pharisees clearly think the blind man and his parents need to hear it. Someone must be blamed. Someone must be labeled wicked for the cruelty of blindness at birth to make any sense at all. And people start casting the aspersion of spiritual blindness on one another. Only Jesus refuses the story everyone else is telling. The reason they claim makes sense. They want labels to explain this man's suffering. We all want suffering to make sense, and it almost never does. But the labels they want to give this man are going to set him and his parents apart as the wrong ones. They probably have done that for all of his life. Set them apart as the sinful ones, even the wicked ones. And I'm sorry to say, every society does this. Not just scribes and Pharisees, but Jesus' own disciples. Not just the Puritans of New England who persecuted and killed people, accusing them of witchcraft about 500 years ago, but ironically, the Anglicans and the German Catholics 100 years before that, from whom the Puritans had fled for religious freedom. And not just early settlers from England, but modern day Americans who are caught in labels and judgments and sides that we mistakenly claim will make us safer. Humans are famous for trying to define things by putting people in boxes, by categorizing and dividing. Sometimes we call people sinners. The church has a long history of using that word in very cruel and divisive ways. Sometimes we call them criminals. Sometimes we call them illegals. Sometimes we call them terrorists. Sometimes liberals. Sometimes conservatives. Sometimes we go, those people. If we can just explain someone away, if we can just label them, then we don't have to see them. We start creating our own blinders with our labels. That is exactly what happens in this film, in both films, in the book. Elphaba is born green. Before anyone knows her compassion, before anyone sees her courage, before anyone hears her story, she is already assigned a role, an outcast. She is different. And different must be dangerous. The wizard who solidifies this opinion, it's fantastic writing. If you haven't read the book, I recommend it. The wizard represents every leader and every system that discovers fear is easier to organize than hope. And don't we see that in our nation today? Don't we see it in our world today? How many of our global leaders are living into this? Well, it's easier to organize people around fear than hope. The wizard says, give them a good enemy. And then he uses fear to create unity amongst the people he wants to follow him. He uses that fear to create certainty that Elphaba and the talking animals are wicked. When this happens, when fear gets used in this way, it keeps people from asking the harder questions. Fear is never in our best interest. And when we refuse to ask the hard questions, we go down that path of history that we know leads nowhere good. Under apartheid in South Africa, an entire political system was born out of fear by convincing one group of people that another group was dangerous, lesser, was supposed to be separate. It didn't come out of nowhere. Apartheid arose from centuries of racism and colonialism, but it came into being in recent times, in the 1940s, with the rise of white nationalism. White nationalism is dangerous stuff. Nationalism is always dangerous stuff, and we have to be careful. Apartheid was not that long ago. Laws enforce those categories. But my friends, the laws could not have survived unless people first believed the story that another group was dangerous, that another group was lesser, that another group was naturally supposed to be separate, that another group was wicked. And once enough people accepted the label, they stopped seeing neighbors and they started seeing threats. The labels became more real than the people. This is what's happening with the blindness that Jesus confronts in John's gospel. This young man's blindness, his label as being the product of sin, prevents people from seeing this man who's just like them, created in the image of God, in need of the compassion of God's people. John structures this story beautifully. It's long, we didn't even read the whole thing. It's 41 verses, it's a whole thing, and it's a really great story. But here's the beauty of the structure and the frightening part of the structure. The blind man gains sight. The religious leaders lose it. They don't see it. The miracle here isn't simply that the blind man can see. The miracle reveals who continues to be blind, who was blind all along because of their labels. If you read the story all the way through, and if you heard April and I, every time the evidence challenges the Pharisees and their assumptions, they refuse to reconsider. They just dig in their heels and say, no. Instead, they ask again and again and again, who sinned? Who's the sinner? The blind man, Jesus, the blind man's parents. When they realize they can't win the argument, what do? They throw the blind man out. Because I hate to say it, but protecting the system for them matters more than receiving the truth. And that's part of what got Jesus killed. This is a frightening aspect of institutions, even religious ones. The scribes and Pharisees are trying to protect a very vulnerable community of faith, Judaism, from a very cruel and oppressive Roman Empire. The scribes and Pharisees know that if they step 1 foot out of line, it's over. The Romans will massacre them at the drop of a hat. The good intentions, however, become all of this self-protection in and of itself, its highest value. And in that self-protecting, they lose sight of their actual primary value: to be a light to the nations, to be the light of holiness and justice for all the world. That is the call that Abraham first received, the call that Moses codified, and that Joshua led them into the promised land to live out. And here they are, about 1,000 years later, and they're so busy self-protecting, they forget to be a light of healing to this young man in their community who was born blind. And lest we think it's just the scribes and Pharisees, John reveals a pretty tough truth, and he was one of those disciples, so I'm guessing he told us what really happened. The disciples, even after months or years of following Jesus, start down the same path as the scribes and Pharisees with that cruel question: who sinned, this man or his parents? It's such a tempting path. Someone must be to blame in order for the world to make sense, in order for their religion to rest secure in a frightening world. And likewise, one of the most chilling moments in the film Wicked for Good comes when the wizard says, "The truth is not a thing of fact or reason. It's just what everyone agrees on." Now, it's a musical. You hear it, you kind of want to laugh. It sounds absurd until we remember history. Apartheid wasn't sustained because everybody secretly hated their neighbors. It was sustained because people accepted the official story about who belonged, who was dangerous, and who had the right for power and control. It was the story, the labels. And the same has been true in every society that has divided people by labels. Whether it's the label of race, the label of nationality, the label of citizenship, the label of gender, the label of sexual orientation, the label of economic status, the label of popularity. Every time we divide that way, we are walking closer to the edge of one of those societies that has fallen apart because it believed the labels. How is that? How do ordinary people just like you and me, become convinced that those labels are reality? It's slow, it's subtle, and it's sinister, but it does happen. The fact is that when enough people believe the story begins to feel like reality. That's what happened in Oz. That's what Jesus is exposing in this healing story of the blind man and Jesus' many conversations with the disciples, the scribes, the Pharisees, and the people of that man's town. The Pharisees have witnessed a miracle. They have just seen a man born blind from birth healed and now able to see. But admitting to the miracle would require them to write a new story. It would require them admitting that the story they've been teaching, that bad things happen because somebody did something bad, isn't actually God's truth. Sometimes bad things happen to good people. The scribes and Pharisees had to have known that. And yet it felt safer to label him and explain it away. They had seen the miracle. And sometimes the greatest blindness is not the failing to see. It's refusing to see differently. This reminds me of one of the most heartbreaking moments in this film. After Elphaba has spent her entire life trying to do what is right, she speaks for those without a voice. She tells the truth. She refuses to cooperate with injustice, and every act of goodness is twisted into another reason to fear her. And this is the moment that breaks my heart. Eventually, she reaches that breaking point and says, if they're going to call me wicked no matter what I do, then maybe that's what I'll become. This is how powerful labels can be. People often begin living inside the identities society gives to them. I know many of you are spending your life trying to get out of those labels that somebody else assigned to you. The cycle is horrible. The cycle in which we try to self-identify as a child of God, and then someone blames us and tries to put us back into that place of hiding. That same cycle appears in the film. Nessa, Elphaba's sister, blames her sister Elphaba because their father first blamed Elphaba. Pain is passed down. Trauma becomes tradition. Blame becomes inheritance. That can happen in families, in churches, in nations, and in systems like apartheid. Those labels, they harm everyone until someone breaks the cycle. And that's what Jesus does. The disciples ask them, who caused this? The man or his parents? And Jesus says, neither. Jesus never asks us to ignore oppression or pretend evil doesn't exist. Justice matters. Naming real harm matters. Holding people accountable matters. But there is a profound difference between resisting injustice and reducing another human being to a single label. These scribes and Pharisees who think they are protecting their people, their community of faith, have just cast this man out with a single label: sinner. Justice asks a very different question. It asks, what happened? And then mercy asks, who is this person? Justice and mercy together. Jesus refuses to let us choose between the two. Jesus refuses that entire framework of putting people into labels and categories. It's such an interesting interchange. He never assigns blame, even to the scribes and Pharisees. Certainly never assigns blame to this man or his parents. He creates healing. While everyone else is dealing and deciding who deserves exclusion, Jesus is restoring relationship. Jesus is not asking anyone to abandon justice and holiness and righteousness, which is what the scribes and Pharisees were called to pursue. He is asking people, both his followers and his adversaries, to pursue justice without surrendering the ability to see the image of God in each and every person we encounter, even the people we oppose. Near the end of Wicked, Elphaba tells Glinda, they need someone to be wicked so you can be good. That line might be the summary of every scapegoating system in history. When human beings need someone wicked so somebody else can be called good. When human beings need someone to be powerless and oppressed so someone else can have power and control. Whether it was apartheid, the Inquisition, Jim Crow, Nazi Germany, or the Pharisees deciding the blind man must be a sinner, or Oz deciding Elphaba must be wicked. The system survives by convincing good people, for good people, that somebody else must carry the blame. But my friends, the gospel tells a different story. Jesus challenges us because Jesus never begins with the label. He begins with the person in front of him. All these other people saw a sinner, a beggar, an outcast, and Jesus saw a beloved child of God. And that raises the question that lingers long after Jesus' encounter with the scribes and Pharisees, long after the movie Wicked will have been forgotten. How do good people, even justice-seeking people, become blind? And then I ask myself, where might I be blind? Who have I reduced to a label? Whose story have I never really heard? And what if the person I call wicked is someone I've never truly seen? These are hard questions, hard insights for us to look into, but the questions don't end the story. Because the good news from this lesson is that blindness never gets the final word. In this story, no one begins by seeing clearly. The blind man can't see. He's not sure who Jesus is. The disciples can't see clearly. The Pharisees can't see clearly. Even the blind man's parents can't see clearly. Sight comes slowly, and that's okay. That's even encouraging. Because if we're honest, every one of us have places where we're a little blind, where we cannot yet see as clearly as God sees. And the miracle of grace is not that we've learned to see perfectly. The miracle is that Christ keeps opening our eyes. Thanks be to God.